Hey everybody, Mrs. Bianchi. Julian's abuela doesn't use a recipe when making her famous tamales. Julian notes how much mesa dough she uses in each tamale and records the results in a box plot as shown. Here it is. Which statement about the box plot is true? So I have this down here just to remind you of how we construct a box plot to help you understand some things about the data. So we might come back and revisit this. Again, we did this in class. You may recall doing it. All right. So, which statement is true about which statement about the box plot is true? A. Most of the tamales have exactly 4.5 tablespoons of mesa dough. If we find 4.5, what is really represented here? 4.5. This line is really the median. Now, the median, and I'm going to use my set of data down here. Recall is the number that's in the middle. So, in our example here, we ordered these numbers from least to greatest and we found the median to be 15. That's not what most of the numbers are in our example here. And that's not going to be true here either because the median is just the number in the middle. B, about 25% of the tamales have less than 5.5 tablespoons of mesa dough. Let's find where the 5.5 is. So that would be here. And let's ask ourselves what's true about these box plots. So 25%. Now in class, we talked about how we can break up our chunks of data into quarters. So this example in class, we mentioned that here's your first chunk, here's your second chunk, here's your third chunk, and here's your fourth chunk. Now, 50% of the data would be above or to the right of this yellow line. 50% of your data would be to the left of it. Now, if we're breaking these things up into quartiles, then that means that if I move this yellow line to say over here, that everything below this yellow line, we have 3 chunks. So that means 3 chunks, 3 out of 4 chunks means 75% of the data would be below it, 25% would be to the right of this yellow line. And let's say I move the yellow line over here, 25% of the data would be below that line, and 75% of the data would be to the right of that yellow line. So it's important that you kind of break things up into those 4 chunks. And I thought that this example that we did in class would be good. So if we try to follow those same chunks on the box and whisker plot, see we have this chunk right here. We have this chunk right here. We have another chunk here. And we have our fourth chunk right here. So again, on a box and whisker plot, half of the data would be on the right, half of the data would be on the left. So let's go back and look at the question and make sure we understand what they're really saying. Now, here's the 5.5. About 25% of the tomatoes have less than 5.5. So does this chunk right here, what I'm going to say is less than 5.5, is that 25% of the data? Remember, anything to the left of that upper quartile, that means that the 25% would be on the other side, right? This over here would represent 25% because remember, all of it is 100%. So doesn't that mean that the 75% would be the data that would be represented in this blue line? So that doesn't really make any sense. C, half of the tamales have less than 4 tablespoons of mesa dough. So let's find, remember, half would be the halfway point is really the same thing as the median. Now, if they're talking about less than 4 is this. This is less than 4. Now, is that half? Half would be all of this. So that doesn't look like that's going to work out for an answer. D, about 50% of the tamales have between 4 and 5.5. So between 4, that's here. Actually, let's use a different color. Let's use red. Between 4 and 5.5. So this is 5.5. Now, is this 50%? All the data that's in this box, is that 50% of the data? That's what you're asking yourself. So let's say you're not sure. I want to remind you how these box plots work. So we have 25% of the data from the lower quartile down to the lower extreme. We have 25% of the data in that next chunk. We have another 25% of the data contained in that third chunk. And then we have the remaining 25% of the data in that last chunk. So you want to be thinking 25, 50%, 75%, 100% until you get to the end, right? So again, let's make sure we understand what they're asking us here. They are asking us whether or not between here and here is that 50% of the data.